about national freedoms. And we lose the point. I hear Paul saying, why would you settle for freedoms down here when God has set you free for freedoms up here? Live to a higher standard. Live to a higher freedom. And then in verse 13, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. Okay, you got that part? You're called to be free. Imagine that. You all have a calling. And that calling involves being free. That call means you're going to live as free people, not as slaves. And many people in Galatia took that at face value. And like many of us, they stopped Paul's message right there. You have been called to be free. But notice the next thing that Paul says. Only, in other words, there's a proviso here on your freedom. He says it's not just any kind of freedom. It's not the kind of freedom that lives without limits. He says, use your freedom not to indulge the flesh. In other words, not to do all kinds of worldly things, but instead use your freedom to humbly serve one another in love. So if you want to live the highest form of freedom, he says, then it's serving one another in love. That's the highest form of freedom. Now, maybe that doesn't sound like freedom. Maybe that sounds like a contradiction. Maybe that sounds like a return to slavehood, but it's not. See, the nice thing about love is that the only way that you can love someone else is voluntarily. No one can force you to love another person. You have to love them voluntarily, or it is not love. And so when you humbly serve one another in love, you are giving yourself the way that Christ gave himself to another. July 1st, tomorrow. And I expect you all to raise your Canadian flags. It is Canada Day. What is Canada Day? Well, it used to be called Dominion Day. And it was the day in 1867 when Canada finally received its independence. Now, it was given in this particular case by Great Britain, and it was determined that they were a united people, a united nation. 1867. A few years before that, 1776, we celebrated another freedom called Independence Day. And there we celebrated this one nation under God. Both of those are celebrating a unity that can come by no other than but by God. And we might want to believe that we can do it on our own. We might want to believe that we can do it by power and by might. We might want to believe that we can do it with our military and our strength. But it is only as we observe the values that God has placed and live them out to their fullest in the freedom to which he has created us that our freedoms will survive. The destination or goal of our Christian life, then, according to Paul, is one of freedom in Christ, freedom in the Spirit, freedom that brings about love of God and love of neighbor. That's not always obvious. It's not always the kind of freedom that we aspire to. I remember when I was growing up, there was a little book called Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Anybody besides me remember reading that? Yeah, a few. It was a cute book. But it also had a very deep message. No, not a Christian message. It had a message of living life without limitations. If you believe that you can do it, you can do anything. Really? Now, as a kid, you're not reading Jonathan Livingston Seagull for that particular purpose. But as an adult, when I reread it, well, let me read you a few quotes. He says, the same rule holds for us now, of course. We choose the next world by what we live in this world. If you learn nothing, and then the next world is the same. All the same limitations that lead to weights that we need to overcome. And again, he says, you will begin to touch heaven, Jonathan, in the moment that you touch that perfect speed. And it isn't flying 1,000 miles an hour or 1,000,000 miles an hour or flying at the speed of light, because any number is a limit. Perfection doesn't have limits. Perfect speed, my son, is being there. In other words, it's a kind of freedom that advocates living without limits, living outside, living with the idea that nothing is out of bounds. That's not the kind of freedom that God is advocating. That was the kind of freedom that the Gnostics advocated. That's the kind of freedom that the existentialists advocated. But it's not the kind of freedom that God advocates. It's also the kind of freedom that we find very often in our U.S. body politic. One of the reasons why we have abortion is because we believe that it is the woman's right to determine what happens in all phases of her life. Not God's. Our individual lives. Gay marriage is because we believe that personal rights are above all other rights. Terrorism is because we believe that social change trumps everything else, including violence. With each one, we exalt freedom over responsibility. But then we come to a pause. Then we come to a stop in this whole Galatians message. Paul says, only, that's his but, he says, do not use this new freedom in Christ to indulge your every desire. It's kind of what we were just talking about, isn't it? But instead, use it to advance our love of neighbor and our love for God. Freedom, then, is an opportunity in the sense of the possibility of an uncoerced action. One of my favorite theologians was Jacques Ellul when I was in seminary. And I remember him saying that freedom is the climate of all ethics. If you don't have freedom, you can't have ethics. You can't act in an ethical way if it's being coerced. Freedom and ethics go hand in hand. If you are free, then you can act ethically. If you are under oppression, then the action's not yours. Kind of ties in with what it's saying, that our freedom brings about love as we serve one another. So Paul says, use your freedom not for earthly pursuits, but for godly ones. The earthly is the carnal, the physical is what he's talking about. The things that we can see, touch, taste, smell. All of the things that we seem to spend all of our life pursuing. Wealth, power, success, new cars, new homes, new boats, new properties, well, you get the picture. And what Paul is saying is all those things can't bring you freedom. All those things can't bring you joy. All those things can't bring you love. Now, For a few of you that are old enough and a few of you that were growing up in houses